Okay, welcome back to I Love You Tea with Trashellie, not sponsored by Yui Hirahara. And thank you for joining us for episode 2. Shout out to everybody who came back and was here last week, who listened to the recording and is here, who is listening to this recording now. We are so grateful for everyone who is here.
It really means a lot that you guys are so excited about this and that you guys are returning.
Yeah. So for voice identification, hi, I'm Elle.
And I'm Ashley.
And today we're going to be continuing our topic from last episode, which was about the use of subversion in the characters of I Love You.
My favorite aspect of I Love You. So last week we talked a lot about some of the characters who I think were a little less obvious about their subversion. Post-K, Rand, Alyssa. We did talk about Yui a little bit, right?
Yes.
Okay, right. This week we decided so that we can dig a little deeper into them, we would save Nol and Shin-Ae for this episode so that we can talk a little more about them than maybe we got to do last week. So I always feel awkward getting started. I'm so sorry. So I'm actually no. Let's go ahead and start with Nol. We'll go with Nol because Nol I think is so clearly laid out for us because he literally has kind of these two compartmentalized personalities. To make it very clear right now, I don't mean that I feel like these are two separate fake personalities or anything like that. I do believe that Yeong-Gi and Nol are very much exactly who Nol is. It's just that he has compartmentalized them into these two versions of himself. And to be fair, Yeong-Gi is definitely an exaggerated version of who he is. But the point is, I do want to clarify that those are definitely aspects of who he is. It's just because he wears Yeong-Gi as a mask. I think for a long time, it did kind of create a little bit of, I wouldn't say confusion, but maybe I would say some wariness people, because it was kind of like, we've gotten to know Yeong-Gi all this time, and people are so comfortable with Yeong-Gi that it's like, what if I don't like who Nol is,
And I think very much the thing about Noel is, like you're saying, like he exaggerates aspects of himself and compartmentalizes. And so, like, in the context of the story, we're introduced to him as this, like, friendly, easygoing, lighthearted, the, like, second male lead redhead character.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, he has so much extra depth to him, and so much intensity to him, but it also, like I mentioned last week, it's not a bait and switch. Like, it's not just a flip. It's that all of these are aspects of himself, and he's just compartmentalizing and pushing what he thinks he should forward, which isn't what he thinks that he's doing necessarily, because he thinks that he's playing the role of the happy kid who's gone. But we know that ultimately those traits are still in there.
Right. Something that I think is really fun about rereading I Love You is that once we know these aspects of these characters and once we've gotten to see the sides that they hide really well, it is so easy to see those aspects of them coming out earlier in the series than people actually realized they were there. I remember when I first started going to the subreddit, seeing posts that were speculating about how Yeong-Gi felt like he was a mask, and that everything about that very first masquerade party felt to them like there was kind of a darker undertone than what was initially perceived, which I think is fair. At the time, because of the way it was phrased, I was like, oh, I don't know about this. But, as time went on, it was easy to see what they meant about the fact that he literally is wearing a mask. His prank was a little on the, this isn't exactly a savory prank kind of side, It wasn't as lighthearted and playful as Yeong-Gi himself tends to be.
And this comes back to something that I had mentioned last podcast, where In a lot of the cases with our characters, when Shin-Ae meets them, they're actually the most themselves that they are in the whole of
Mhm.
early story. When she meets Kosuke, he's, insulting her and throwing things at her, and he's stressed, and he is expressing that he's like trying to keep everything together, instead of being the gentleman who can handle everything and is prim and proper. When she meets Yui, she's stepping out of that limousine, kind of in this power position, almost looking down on all of them and creating this terror in Nol. Um, when when she meets even Alyssa, she meets Alyssa before Alyssa understood what the kids at school expected of her and became
I
so scared. Um,
Yeah, I think she is the one person who has ever gotten to meet the real Alyssa.
I would agree with that because we know that even her family hasn't, but I do think that Shanae did.
Mhm.
Um, and when she meets Noel, a very similar thing happens where, like you said, he's wearing this mask, but he's ultimately showing more of himself than he did later. He has that whole conversation with her about how he hates the parties, he hates the people at them, he hates all of this world. He plays this prank that is a little questionable enough that Minhyuk was even like, Shanae would have never come up with something like that. Um, he keeps warning her about things and like seeing through her and ultimately comparing themselves, even though she doesn't realize that that's what he's doing. um and it's only after she meets him again that she kind of takes off that perception a little bit. I mean, she even calls him Mr. Stalker, but she
Right.
like said it in a much less playful way the first night because he was like kind of intense.
Persistent.
Yeah, in the way that he came on, which is more in line with those elements of himself that he doesn't let out later on, where he's still wearing the mask, but she does get to see stronger glimpses of him that night, and he is more like the Noel that's coming out now at that masquerade party than he had been up until close to the court arc.
Right. Um, a really interesting thing that I've kind of been thinking about that I don't think we explore a lot is usually characters are wearing a mask because they are hiding parts of themselves. They are projecting an image. They're playing a role that they think that they need to or that they must play. But I think especially in Noel's case during that masquerade, wearing a mask is not so much a sense of self-preservation as it allows him for that moment to be who he really is. Because despite the fact that he has red hair and green eyes and how many other characters look like that, when she takes him to the hospital, the nurse doesn't recognize who he is until she takes off that mask. So, as much as Noel himself is constantly wearing a mask in the form of Yeong-Gi, when he's wearing the mask at the masquerade, I feel like it allows him to be a little more free. Where, right, he doesn't have to project as much. He doesn't have to pretend to be something he's not. He allows himself a little more honesty than he might ordinarily allow himself.
And I think kind of a recurring theme with Noel is actually this like battle between him wanting to be his authentic self and him thinking that for the world to be a good place, he can't. And this is actually kind of similar to Alyssa's struggle, except for her, it's more internal in that she thinks that the world can't accept who she actually is. Whereas with Noel, he thinks that he can exist in the world as how he is, but bad things will follow him and befall other people if he does. So it's better for the world if he's not. Um,
Right. He's not allowed to indulge in being who he really is.
yes. So when he's wearing the mask on top of the mask, he's able to and allows himself a little bit more to indulge in those aspects of himself that he is usually shoving down because he does want to be able to be himself. He just doesn't think that he should.
Right. And I think that really helps foster that connection that he makes with Shanae because even though he's pretty much double masked up, and she's wearing the world's flimsiest mask ever. Um, because he's allowing himself that kind of sense of honesty and indulging in her, like her personality, we can see that he's pretty instantly drawn to her. Like when he sees her at the formal, or not the formal, the masquerade, he pretty much kind of like sought her out because he knew she was going to be there. Um, and I feel like he's the kind of person who, like he said, he's very tired of these parties. I think in his mind, this is probably like the one time that they were ever going to run into each other. And if it did work out where he hit it off with her and he could, try playing Cupid with her and Dita, maybe, that would be great. But I feel like for him, it was very much a night of indulgence. And it's really interesting because it kind of reinforces that mentality he has, that when he indulges, when he allows himself to enjoy someone's company, when he allows himself to just kind of act his age, bad things do end up happening. He winds up in the hospital with, Kosuke kind of lording over there. Um, and it's just really interesting how like all of those elements that we come to know later on in the story have always been there from the very beginning. Like even as he starts to push that Yeong-Gi front and he takes off his initial mask, it's like Shin-Ae has this way of disarming him. Like I know I talk about this a lot, but it's one of my favorite aspects of who they are, and I think it has so much to do with the fact that they mirror each other, and he is able to see so much of himself in her that she just has this way of disarming him. And I guess it also has a lot to do with the fact that she just notices things that he is so used to being invisible towards other people, that how can he not help but like let that mask flip a little bit. So even early on we're seeing that in him.
Yeah, and I think you're very much right about it kind of being a night of indulgence for him, where he meets this girl, he thinks that he's only going to see her once. There's, things for him to do now to like enter him that he wants to indulge in, and he like seeks her out. Um, and then when he does meet her again, he kind of plays up the Youngie mask to the extreme. Like, I don't know
Mhm.
that he has ever been quite as happy child puppy dog as he was the next time that he saw her. And it could have been conscious, it could have been subconscious, but he was likely trying to make up for the fact that he let her see through a little bit and he did indulge that night.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Like he feels like he has to double down because she's seen too much, and he doesn't want her to know that there's something more, which is really funny because I feel like also in those early scenes, we kind of see how Noel is shifting from wanting to play Cupid to being very indulgent about pursuing Shanae's friendship for himself. I don't think he's quite aware of it at the time. He's probably telling himself that this is all for his friend. None of this really matters. None of this means anything. But I think we can kind of see some of that authenticity in him, and the that desire to have that connection, because she is somebody who he sees so much of himself in. And as much as he is pursuing her friendship because he wants to help her and pull her out of that shell, I think it's also that he wanted that for himself, even if he wasn't acknowledging it, even if he wasn't being honest with himself. I think he very much wanted somebody to do for him what he was doing for her. And she kind of does.
Absolutely. And I think that we can see this in some of the big scenes with um especially I think um the earbud scene where afterwards he texts Peter and he has that conflicting expression, and like the hospital balcony where he has that conflict again. But I think the vibe of that conflict comes out especially in the earbud scene. And I honestly wonder, was it ever fully about Dieter? Because if you think about it, even if you're like, Nola's essentially chasing putting good out into the world and being this support for other friends, but would is it really a good idea to try to set your buddy up with the girl who's already rejected him?
Right.
And
I
so
mean,
like,
I I think I do think that he had the good intentions at that time in the sense that he was hoping that if he was able to help her see the side of Dita that he knows, that maybe she would come around to him. But I don't think it lasted a very long time, or not authentically. I think it was very early on that it kind of started to become more of a selfish indulgence that he was telling himself is for the sake of his friend. Like, I think a lot about the scene where he goes to pick Shin-Ae up from school when she's late, and how he's very decidedly taking responsibility for her being late. Like he makes up that whole lie about how they're carpooling together. And even though it's that way that she's parroting back his words to Dita about, like, don't say these kinds of things about yourself, and he does that little wry smile, and I was so conflicted for like so long about whether or not is this that he is pleased that she's making those changes, that his words are getting through to her and now she's using them on other people. Is it because by this point he already knew that he was planning to leave and had no intention of telling people, and he was starting to feel bad about it? Was it that those unconscious feelings are stirring there and it was like some kind of unconscious jealousy that he wasn't aware of? I feel like it's probably a little mix of all of the above at this point. But, like, I've gone back and forth on that for so long because it's little moments like that that just always really stand out to me, where it's like, does he actually feel confident in trying to continue setting them up or not?
And I think you're right about it being a complex mix of all of the things at once, which not only is a recurring theme in I Love You, but especially with Nol. Um, and I think absolutely it started shifting away from being about Dieter very quickly. Um, and I think the reason I think it might not have been always entirely about Dieter is because I think he probably could feel that draw, and I think he felt that there was something that he should take her in for, and I think that he thought that it was setting up Dieter and helping her, but I think he had a little bit of that curiosity about her
That,
from
yes,
the
I
beginning.
definitely think that. When he says, or when they're talking over breakfast, and I think it was Soshi who makes the comment about, you already have a girlfriend, and how Noel is kind of like, yeah, but then Dita would have a girlfriend, and then I would have a new friend, and
Everybody.
like that win-win kind of thing for him.
Mhm.
That part, yes, it's one of those where it's more like it's hard to tell if he's just telling himself this is all for Peter or not. But yes, I think that curiosity was always there. Like that's the thing that they both have in common, is that even when she was trying to shove him away and she wanted nothing to do with him, that curiosity was still there, that easiness was still there. Like when they're both getting really excited when she's telling him how the prank played out, and she gets so swept up in the moment and
It's a
like,
great
we make a
scene.
great team, right? And she catches herself. That was something really fascinating to me about rereading, is realizing that sense of not so much attraction, but just like that sense of chemistry and that easiness has been there from the get-go. And even now she's becoming aware of that it was always easy, even when she
Always.
didn't want it to be.
It was always so easy, and it goes both ways. Where at first he was pushing it, and she was pulling away, and the chemistry and natural easiness was drawing both of them in. But he was our in the mask. He was already willing to be drawn in, even
Mhm.
though they drew the real him in too. Whereas she didn't so much want to be drawn in, but she was. And then later on, when he discards that mask and thinks that there's not a place for each other in their lives anymore because of it, that same chemistry draws him back in and has her fighting for him.
I love watching her fight for him too. Like, I know this is supposed to be
I
subversion, but it's
know we've
like
gone off.
we can't help it. And I think it's so hard to like have this conversation very compartmentalized the way that we need to, because of the fact that they're mirrors, because of the fact that they overlap and overlay each other so much. But to go ahead and kind of segue to her for a little bit, I do think that that's something really interesting, is that because things with Nol are so easy, it really helps for Shin-Ae's very flimsy mask to fall away so quickly and so easily. Um, Something about her that really stood out to me as we started to get to know her better as the story went on is when there were people out there who still kind of saw her as like, oh, she's like this really tough bitch character who doesn't care about what other people think of her, and that's so relatable to me. Like, but that's not who she is. Um, and I like how for Shin-Ae, it's very much that this is her form of self-preservation, and it stems from being afraid. And I don't know, but that like really resonates to me, because it's not that Shin-Ae ever thought herself above things. It's not that she thought, she's not like those girls. It's not that she thought that, she's superior to these people. It's that she was so afraid, and she wanted to reach out to people, and she wanted them to reach out to her, but she was so afraid to try and make that connection again and have it go so badly and have things end up hurting her again so much.
And it's really pointed that back in middle school, there's essentially two people that she really befriends, right? There's Alyssa and Minhyuk. And she reaches out to Alyssa and she puts her all into that friendship. And that's the one that crashes and burns. Whereas Minhyuk more so reached out to her and was putting the effort into their friendship. And that's the one that she kept. So she must be so terrified to reach out her own hand again. And so when Nol comes along and reaches out to her like that, that's what ends up being able to start opening her up and breaking down her walls, even though she doesn't want them to. And we see how much effort it takes for that to happen, because she's just so afraid of putting her all into someone again and getting burned without closure. Not even so much getting burned, but being left and abandoned again.
Right. And thinking about it that way, it makes the fact that, she's calling him Mr. Stalker as mostly a joke. But I do think that there was eventually a sense of affection to it, because that's exactly what it is. It's that it felt like he was fighting very hard for her the way that she had fought for Alyssa. Um, and even if she's not consciously acknowledging it that way or interpreting it that way, there must be a sense of flattery to having spent your whole life where, people believe rumors about you. They pass judgment about you based on your mother, who you're not even connected to, let's be frankly real about. Um, the fact that bullies fall into the belief about these rumors, they never give her a chance. Nobody wants to know her for who she really is, aside from Minhyuk. And so when Nol comes here, like determined to break down her walls, determined to pull her out of her shell, how can she not, how can she resist letting him do that? Like that sense of indulgence, that sense of, this feels nice. It feels nice to have somebody who is fighting for me, who I want to be there for. And I love watching that kind of development happen, because I know I say it a lot, but so much of Nol and Shin-Ae's development is it's a constant thing that's always happening under the surface, just kind of out of the corner of their eye, where they can't really see it happening. But like when a little plant is growing, and one day there's like a tiny sprout, and then 2 days later that thing has grown like 3 inches somehow. That's how I feel like they are. That one day he's just like this obnoxious person who will not leave her be. And then suddenly she realizes that he's this person that she absolutely cannot lose touch with in her life.
And I was gonna say before until you said it, but their so much of their development is unconscious, and that's so much of the point, that it just happens and they just feel it. And they really came along as exactly what each other needed. Like in Shanae's case, she needed that someone who was going to reach out to her again, but in a way that she both wants wanted to indulge in it and couldn't push it off because, I mean, even if people did reach out to her, we saw what her response was because she just can't let herself care like that again. Um, but and
Right. The
so, oh
letting herself care feels like a risk, and she
yeah,
doesn't want any chances of risk. She needed to buckle everything down.
yeah, so much had happened already. Um, and then, but on the flip side, for Nol, she also comes along as exactly what he needs, where he, is putting up this mask, doesn't says that he doesn't want anyone to see him, doesn't want any attention, doesn't want anyone to care about him, um, and is always, deflecting and focusing on other people and wearing this mask and being an exaggerated version of himself that he doesn't believe is himself and shoving down his real emotions to do it. But then Shin-Ae comes along, this person that he befriended to improve her life, maybe improve Dieter's life, maybe tap a little bit of his curiosity about her. Um, but then because her thing is that she does care so much about people, and the wall that had to be broken down for her was feeling okay to care about somebody again. When she starts to care about him, she just sees him and cares about him and gives him all of that attention and care and visibility that he pretended not to want but really craved. And that indulgence of what he thinks is selfishness, um, from her. And so they both just come along as exactly the thing that each other are pretending that they don't want and they don't need, and giving it to them in a way that it just crumbles their walls and they indulge in these things that they haven't felt safe to.
Right. And that's the thing too, right? It's like it's so easy to tell yourself that I don't need this. This doesn't matter. I've got to get to this point. None of this is something that means anything to me. But the moment you get that taste for it, the moment that you go from telling yourself, I don't need this to, oh, this feels nice. It's like, how do you go back from that? How do you return to lying to yourself when you have now experienced something that has proven your lies to you to be lies? It's like that. I think that's the thing that always gets me about them is how can they, like Noel was so certain he was going to leave everybody and go off to Oxford, and he wasn't even going to say anything to them about it. And it's like, had he considered what it was going to feel like to leave all of them? Because by the time he's made this decision, he knows that the friendships that were never supposed to mean anything have become real. Like not just Shin-Ae, but with Dieter and with Soshi as well. Like he admits that that's the point where he realizes, oh, this is all real. And he allowed himself to enjoy it until Yui reminds him what happens when he indulges. So it's like, you kind of look at that and it's like, did he really think that it was going to work out for him like that? Did he really think that just walking away from everything was going to be, I mean, maybe he didn't ever think it was going to be easy, but it's just one of those things that always kind of sticks out to me. Is like, did he think that was actually going to go down? And I guess part of that is too because it's so easy to convince himself that he doesn't mean anything to people, that even when these three people have made him feel special, it's like, what if I'm just making this up? What if this is all in my head? What if I walk away and they really don't care at all? And maybe that was part of that undercurrent for him.
And I feel like ultimately a recurring point in I Love You with our characters is kind of the difference between the lies that you tell yourself being reinforced or being disproven. Where, like, we've talked about how with Alyssa, part of the reason why she does what she does and makes the choices that she does and hasn't been able to learn to do anything differently is because she has all of these beliefs about herself and beliefs about the way that the world works that have been instilled in her through growing up that were reinforced throughout her experiences in middle school, and especially with the way that Shinlissa ended. where of course she's going to like continue to hide in what works. Whereas, with Shin-Ae and Nol to each other and such, they have essentially been disproving all of these lies that they've been telling themselves. And Shin-Ae even says it when she confronts Nol on the balcony, where, when she first met him, she said that humans suck, but it was really a lie that she told herself because she needed to believe it. But then he came along and deconstructed that for her and kind of forced it in front of her that it isn't really true. Um, Even to the point where she puts "you don't suck that much" on his little orange birthday card. But they ultimately are doing that for each other, and that ends up being so much of a catalyst for how our characters are and are not able to grow. Where do the people around you reinforce the lie, or do they break down the lie?
Right. Kind of that sense of nurturing. Like Noel and Shanae are offering a much needed sense of nurturing that is absent from their lives up until now. But right, Alyssa unfortunately has yet to get that. And one time that Shanae does try to offer it, it doesn't reach her the way that it should because of how everything transpires afterwards, just kind of reinforcing her fears, reinforcing everything that she's so afraid of, and that this is how you have to do it. You have to fit in. You have to be able to blend in. Otherwise, this is what happens. Um,
Yes.
which I think is very similar to with Kosuke, which makes sense because Alyssa and he are mirrors. They foil Shin-Ae and Nol at every opportunity. Neither one of them have ever gotten that reinforcement that they need to change. It's more that reinforcement that they need to stay on this path.
Exactly. And like ultimately for both of them, something deep down like knows that it feels wrong, but with something like that, it feels wrong because you're wrong. The world is right. Um
Right.
so like you're you're going to continue going down those paths. And we can see with Nolan and Shanae that they also had that feeling deep down that, it's something about this is wrong. But up until the point where our story really starts and we see the things that are able to start breaking through that for them, they continue reinforcing the path that they're on and that this is how they should be going because they hadn't had anything to dissuade that yet.
Right. This feels like a very weird segue to make, but it kind of makes me think about. So I don't think we got to touch upon this a lot yet, but how Noel kind of enters the story appearing like a second lead, right?
Mhm.
Where the second lead is that selfless guy who's like super bubbly. He's always putting others first. He always tends to other people's needs. He's so accommodating. um, Obviously, we know that that's not who he is in the entirety, but because he appears in this kind of not so much role, but because people perceive him that way, they kind of perceive that the Shin-Ae and Nol storyline is going to follow a very, typical second lead trajectory where, oh, maybe she's going to connect with him, but for some reason she's still going to choose the asshole, even though this is the guy who makes her happy because, like the second lead syndrome, blah, blah, blah. Um, and it's just kind of like one of those things about how that sense of perception and expectation permeates both fandom as well as the characters, how even they're struggling to deal with their own perceptions and their own expectations and what is being reinforced, where with the tropes and stuff, it's so easy to reinforce something whether or not it's true, right? Like it was very easy for people to see Noel as a second lead just because he checks some specific boxes, because certain scenes play out a certain way, and because you have these expectations about how things go. And I do feel like that was one of those things that, much like when it comes to Kosuke and people seeing him as a first lead, by looking at Noel this way, a lot of people really did lose out so much on who he was. So by the point where that Yeong-Gi mask is starting to slip and we're starting to see more and more of Nol, like that point in the story where like every time you went on Reddit, there were always comments going like, I miss seeing Youngie smile. I miss when he was happy. And like you just kind of felt that there's a lot of people that are missing what is happening right now and kind of missing the fact that Youngie was only a mask. He's a part of him, but he wore Youngie like a mask. And what people are missing is his mask. So like as he's revealing himself, it was like you've connected with the mask and you're struggling to connect with Nol, much like Alyssa. But it was just really funny, I think, to watch in real time because and I think it goes back to like I don't want to knock people who read for a ship, but it also feels like when you're reading such a drama heavy story like this, you're not going to get fed your ship the way that you want. Um, and so it felt like to me that when people are saying that they miss Youngie, they don't like watching these changes happening, is because they wanted to get back to where everything was a rom-com. Except what we've come to see is that nothing was ever a rom-com. I Love You has always presented itself as what it was from the get-go. And that's something that's really, like I said, it's very fascinating about going back and rereading and seeing just how much of that was already at the forefront of the story before people were actually aware of it, before we were like really connecting those dots, because you're focusing on one aspect. Those little subtle things, the foreshadowing, it goes right over your head until you get to the point where it's like, oh, you know what? A lot of this is actually making so much sense now.
And ultimately, when we come into the story with certain expectations and, you know, go through that journey, we're intending to kind of mirror the journey of the characters. Like how you mentioned, there are characters that view each other in very much the same way that the readers would view them when coming in with these expectations. So, like, when people get attached to Youngie as the mask, and you know, there's that one day where Nol comes out, even though it's been kind of looming on the corner, you're going through that kind of, I guess, like betrayal and grieving process with the characters,
Mhm.
but also have to come to terms with and recognize the fact that that mask wasn't the reality, and that was what we fell for because of our expectations and not looking deeper, and what the characters fell for because of their expectations and not looking deeper.
Right. Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon for me to watch because by the time I can't remember exactly the point in the story that I came in, but like I wasn't there for that whole process, that whole journey of watching how through the black and white formal we start to see more and more of Noel coming out despite his Youngie mask. But from the point that I was starting to delve into the fandom and really taking in how people interpret, characters, scenes, motivations, you kind of start to get the sense of, I don't want to say necessarily what people read for, because I feel like that's kind of an unfair judgment. But I think the way that people talk about characters very often says a lot about how they perceived those characters and whether or not they have also been able to, like you said, kind of like reconcile with who these characters are actually becoming. I feel like this was especially prominent when talking about Kosuke, as he starts to crumble, as like the stress is starting to get to him, and probably coupled with mommy's special treats and like the drinking and things like that. It was really interesting to watch how people would discuss Kosuke, especially how do I say this? Like, there were times where I would try to have conversations about what is going on with him and how it's really clear that he is struggling, how he is trying to talk himself into believing that this is a life that he actually wants, that he wants to continue pursuing this, where Kosuke is a character that people took at face value all the time. Like Kosuke's good at his job. He's, very intelligent. He raced ahead of all of his peers so that he could join the workforce early. Obviously, like now we have that confirmation that it was all because he was trying to reach his father. But even at that time, when we're starting to see maybe he is not happy, there was a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? There was a lot of pushback where people were like, "No, of course he's happy. Why wouldn't he be? Like he's the Hirahara heir, blah blah blah." And and I feel like that's just such a really interesting thing because I Love You is so pointedly deep, um, and it's just I don't know. I guess I feel like it's really interesting to see the points at which people start to see that depth that's actually been there and how long it's actually been there. And I
Especially
guess,
because
oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, especially because, like you said, it's been there the whole time, and you can see it seeping through the whole time, and you can go back and you can find it, and it's really our mindset when reading the story that blinds us to it.
Right. Um, something that something else that always stands out to me about I Love You is how Kimchi has talked about the many iterations it's gone through as she herself has acquired more experience in life with people, learning how people deal with their problems, and just kind of that evolution and how because she knows this story so intimately and so deeply, she's able to show us that much foreshadowing from the beginning. She is able to show us who these characters are without entirely removing that mask. And then, that very careful subversion that comes along. And the way that again it works so effortlessly for the story to the extent that when it starts to become apparent that I Love You was not in fact the romantic comedy that people let themselves believe despite the drama label on the webtoon, and when that drama starts to come forth, how many people were like, oh, I don't like this, like why is she changing the story on us? It's like it's always been there. It's always been there. Go back and reread. It was always there. Like I know like every time this conversation comes up, whether it's on Discord or Reddit, people are like, the prologue. The prologue alone shows you this. But I feel like it's even in things with like how Shin-Ae's food scarcity got treated as such a joke, largely I think because like in universe her friends weren't aware of it and treated it as a joke, but fandom took this at face value and they're like, ha, Shanae's such a fat ass, she loves food so much just like me. It's like, no, that girl is food motivated because she doesn't know where her next meal is coming from. Like it's little things like that where taking something, especially in like taking something in I Love You at face value is just like that's always going to be like the first mistake. Like I've gotten to the point where I'm like, okay, this is my face value impression of this. So
So
what
why
do
is it
I think
wrong?
is really going on? Right.
Yeah, and like with Shanae, we see it like with her food scarcity so strongly at the arcade where she,
Mhm.
played off for laughs and they're having this, fun joking game day and was like, "Well, I'm going to offer to buy you dinner because holding your donut worked last time." But she works so hard to get it that she literally faints. And when she wakes up her first thought is, "Well, there goes my ability to get dinner tonight because there's nothing waiting for her at home." In the prologue, she's scraping together, recyclables to buy eggs. And we know that she's food scarce because we see it through her flashbacks and through her daily life. But I think one of the things about particularly early I Love You, and this is probably coming from again kind of that like rom com shoujo um mode is where a lot of the times, the problems that characters have will be overplayed. Where like they're not
Mhm.
written to have an actual strong effect on the character and like a deep impact on their motivations and the way that they act in their life. But they're like, the writing will treat it like it's this huge deal, or the other characters will treat it like it's this huge deal. Whereas in I Love You, it kind of goes opposite, where the writing starts by playing it off, and the other characters don't really notice it. But as you learn the characters more and more, you can see how strongly it actually factors into what they do on just like a deep core level, where it's not something that, can just be overtly pulled out and addressed, because it's not this, one thing with this one effect. It's this thing that has just shaped and molded them as they've continued down their path of life and is a part of them.
It's such subtle writing that I'm so envious of. Like even when I would write a lot, is I think it's very hard to capture show not tell very well. And I feel like that's something Kimchi actually does so well, regardless of whether or not readers want to, see what she's showing. Um, like thinking too about the arcade day, I'm pretty sure that very same day was when Shin-Ae has that conversation with Dieter, and he offers to share his lunch with her because she doesn't have a lunch. So like the
Yeah,
fact that not only does she get herself worked up so hard from the arcade that she winds up fainting, like she hadn't eaten at all that day before that. Um, and I understand why this is something that passes over people's heads at first, but it's really interesting when you kind of catch those, I guess, more casual readers who kind of haven't like really fully caught on to who these characters are yet, even as we get further into the story. um and like again, I'm not going to say I fault people who are casual readers, because not everybody wants to, do a whole bunch of homework for what they're reading. Not
I
everybody wants to go and write 8, 11 page essays. Like,
I
who
really
would want
can't
to
understand
do that?
why. I can't relate. Um,
And I think that's like the thing about what the fandom has become at this point, is that we are people who love to read into it. It is that we love that these characters are so nuanced and multifaceted that no matter how many times we reread this, we're always picking up something that we never really noticed, or we're finally seeing it in a different light. And it's like, oh my gosh, this thing that was happening back then, like I never thought anything of it, and now it just makes so much sense to me. um and again, like I feel like I Love You is such a rewarding story if that's something that you're interested in. I know like I Love You is never going to reclaim the fandom that it once had, and frankly, I'm just gonna put it out there, good riddance. um, like if like I'm not going to try and drag somebody back into the story if all that they were ever interested in was the romance. Do I think that this is one of the best written romances that I've ever read? Absolutely. Like there are so few romances I've read that are written in such a well done, subtle show not tell. You're at no point did Kimchi have to come out and tell me that these characters like each other. Like it was so clear to me, like
it just
before we even
happened.
knew, right? Like we're watching it happen. But
And
I'm not going to be like, read I Love You because the romance is great, because I don't like it when people, just come into the Reddit and make posts about, oh, when are we going to get back to this? Or, like, we've got a Kosuke centric episode, and people are like, when are we getting back to Stalkyoo? Kosuke's having a breakdown. Let him have a breakdown.
let us analyze who he is, because everyone is important, okay? Um, but yeah, but I Love You has, I feel like, a very specific audience. And I always say that I Love You is incredibly fun if you love to analyze it. If you are
Mhm.
not into obsessing over the details and analyzing it, it's not fun at all. Um, and
Right.
I think that really is the case. And so like you said, it's not worth it for anyone involved to drag people back in who aren't interested in that, because it's just not the right experience. But I also love what you said about Kimchi's ability to do show not tell, and I'm going to comment on her own slight self-deprecation if Kimchi ever listens to us, which I doubt she ever would.
I would
But
die.
mentioned that somebody mentioning that if they saw her in the street, they'd flip out, even though they'd be cool with a celebrity. I'm like, I understand. But she, whenever she puts out a really visual episode, she's like, "Oh, it's gonna be so short. Like, I'm sorry. Please take your time. Like, I'm sorry, it's all visuals." And it's like that is some of the best work in I Love You because both in terms of the characters and the plot itself, she also does it so well with the actual visual imagery of that concept of show don't tell, where like it just permeates all of the writing of I Love You in all facets, that concept. And
Right.
like and with Noel and Shanae's relationship development, like that whole like we we know that it happened and we can track like kind of a gradient of it happening, but it was also so complex and so messy and so unknown to them while also being known, and unknown to us while also being known. And now it's here, but it's been here for so long, but when did it really start? Because there's not a clear start point, because it just develops so naturally, and like you said, no one ever had to come out and say it. It just happened.
Mhm. Something I think about a lot with the regards to how they're written and how actual romance happens is, for the most part, you don't know when you start to like someone, when you fall in love with someone. You might know the moment that you noticed it, that it stood out to you, that it became apparent to you. But when it comes to feelings and how the development of these are very platonic feelings and these are now romantic feelings, and the fact that they blur, and that romantic and platonic feelings aren't even necessarily a separate thing, you know how do you track that? And I think it's just, again, it's just so well done, because you look at moments like the chicken nugget hand holding and listening to a song together, and how at the time it's kind of like, are there romantic undertones, or am I reading into this because I want there to be romantic undertones?
Mm-hmm.
I've talked a lot about how I really do love the concept of platonic soulmates so much, because I love the idea of a person who means so much to you, but there aren't romantic relationships or romantic feelings. But as I Love You went on longer and longer, you start to really get that sense that no, that this is not straight up strictly platonic. And I know a conversation you and I have been having a lot recently is thinking about where is the story going to go long term? Where will Stalkyoo end up in the grand scheme of things? And how, to me, they're just like this tier of soulmates that is just like completely all on their own. Like there's nothing else that really relates to it, to me. And that feeling, that concept of like, okay, suppose something happens in the future, God forbid, and they don't end up with each other. How do you date anybody else? And how do they ever come to compare to this person who, like, basically shaped you, broke down your walls, helped mold you into this version of yourself that you've become, who saw you when others never did, who meant so much to you that you fought for each other this way? How do you go on to, like, ever be with anyone else? Like, to me, I at some point in time, you start to realize that even if you're telling yourself, okay, I'm reading this completely without a romantic lens, anything that I think could be possibly romantic, I'm going to look for another meaning in it. And at some point in time, you get to the point where, like, there's absolutely nothing platonic going on here. Like, I am sorry to all of the 151 deniers, but like, that man cupped her face.
Oh
He
my god,
stroked her, like, he's probably wiping away a tear. She's
there was
letting
nothing
him.
horrible about this.
Like, she's literally letting him do this. When they hug, she turns her face into the crook of his neck. Like, there's nothing platonic. That was a
And
full
then
on we're breaking up
into
moment.
him returning that neck crook back in
Oh,
4219. I don't know
Uh,
the exact episode because I remember how they were broken up, but in the hospital room, when he was laying on her, like, it's just there gets to a point where it's like this is it's a disservice to the writing and the characters to see anything else. And the thing
right.
with the two of them is that it's almost impossible to talk about them without talking about them together. Like, even today, we came with bullet points separate. We came with this idea of talking about how they subverted their tropes and who they are in the narrative, and we turned
We
it into
couldn't.
what?
We couldn't. Not
We
the way we
couldn't.
planned.
We turned it into an unintentional Stalkyoo episode because they're just so woven into the narrative and woven into each other's character development. It's impossible to talk about either of them or the story of I Love You without talking about the way that they interact and the effect that they have on each other and that bond that they have.
And like you said, it is a disservice to the writing. Not to detract from Stalkyoo, but like on the story as a whole, we have experienced this over like the last few years. Is like for how long did people continue to believe that Yui was in fact Nol's mom, despite how very early on Kosuke had referred to Nol's grandma not as grandma or nana, but calling her Mrs. Lockling. How like there, I feel like something that was really difficult with the I Love You fandom until recently, and trying to have discussions is a lot of things are planted or revealed visually or through subtext very early on, but it doesn't get confirmed until much later. And there's so many people who would disregard things because until it's proven true, I'm not going to believe it. We still sometimes see it with trying to talk about Alyssa's sexuality and how because it has never been outright stated, there are people who refuse to believe it. It's
Yeah.
like the writing wants us to pick up on this long before it ever gets revealed. The writing wanted us to realize from the get-go that Yui is not Nola's mom. And even if you don't pick up on it in the moment where Kosuke is referring to Nana as Mrs. Lockline, you're supposed to remember those moments as you start to notice, gee, Yui and Nol sure have a really weird relationship, don't they? That's a really weird mother and son relationship. The fact that when Shin-Ae mentions your mom when she's waiting at the bus stop with Nol, and he has that moment of panic when he freezes before he realizes, oh, she's talking about Yui, not my mom. Like that was supposed to be a tell for us. And it's the
Yeah.
same for Kosuke. He's telling us so early on, I don't want this. I'm not happy. This isn't the life I want. I didn't choose any of this. But when you would try to have conversations with people, they'll be like, no, he wanted this. He even made his schedule. Like, that doesn't mean you want it. Like, we lie to each other all the time. Like, every single day we're lying to ourselves. I go to work and I have to sit there and chant at myself that you love your job because you don't want to get thrown out on the streets and live under a bridge because your cat will go and kill birds and squirrels and you don't want to watch that. Like it's I Love You is so well done, but if you ignore all of the subtext, you lose the story. And if like you have to wait until it's confirmed textually, like you are leagues behind everybody else. Like 151 really was that confirmation for us where it's like, oh, there have been feelings. Like all of these moments that I thought might be romantically tinged were in fact romantically tinged. Maybe they hadn't figured it out in this moment yet, but it was there. But
What
people continue to deny it even now because, oh, Noel said that he doesn't like her. Then why was his heart rate monitor just going off the charts like that, huh?
literally he makes that stupid face at Dieter and goes, I know that you like her. That's like what he's doing to readers, and like, I'm sorry, you want me to believe him on that? But also, like, one of the big things about the way that Kimchi writes and the way that I Love You is written is that, um, like, we are, like you said, we are supposed to pick up on these little moments that build and let them build off of each other and make our conclusions on that subtext, because ultimately that's how life works. That's how perceiving other people works. That's how figuring out things in life works. You're never going to get every single thing explicitly confirmed. That's just not going to happen. And there are things in comic in universe that may never be explicitly confirmed, but that's just the way that people work. And if I Love You is anything, it is a realistic depiction of human psychology and relationships. And like you were talking about with, um like Kosuke and Alyssa and even Nol and Shin-Ae, a lot of the way that they foil themselves to us and that we're supposed to pick up on is that they all have this dichotomy of what we want versus what we think we have to do. Like in the way that, you and I have been office girlies all week and been getting up and going even though we don't want to. But I, I'd way rather stay in bed all day with my cats and scream about I love you with everybody. But I also have to have money to live, therefore I have to have a job. So that's like a what I want versus what I have to do. And within what I have to do, I make it something that I at least sort of want. And that's ultimately what our characters are doing, where their wants are one thing and what they believe they have to do is another. And they're creating the best outcome within what they, have to do. Um, but there's also that varying scale of like, is this actually something that they have to do or not? But we are supposed to pick up on what it is that they want and when they are lying to themselves and when they are doing things that they don't actually have to and why they think they have to do the things that they do. And we're supposed to not need it all confirmed because, as aforementioned, life isn't that simple. You don't get everything spelled out for you.
Right. And it's just, yeah, it's just, it feels like such a disservice to ignore things that are being told to us just because it isn't yet explicit. Um, like you said, there's such good psychological understanding. And I don't mean in the sense of, okay, this character has PTSD, so they're written to match that. Like, something I envy so much about how these characters are written is that everybody makes sense within the confines of their environment, within the confines of their experiences, and within the confines of their motivation. You have to look at characters through their own point of view sometimes, because ultimately we are, the main characters of our own story. No matter how selfless a person you are, you're still ultimately going to be trying to meet your own needs, even if you think that fulfillment of other people's happiness is your driving need. Chances are it's not true. I say therapy is for everyone. Learn yourself inside out. But you know, it's that's what I love so much. It's like, is Yui a character who I think is making the right choices? Absolutely not. But does she make sense within the confines of what we have seen about her so far? Yes. A lot of people do not agree with Alyssa's choices and what she does. But does she make sense within the confines of the household she's grown up in, what her deepest fear is, what is motivating her? Ultimately, I think both in writing and interpreting characters in something that's well written is you have to understand what the motivations are about the characters. And to do that, you have to understand what matters to these characters. And this goes back to what you were saying is you cannot always take them at face value because ultimately we're always going to be lying to ourselves, whether or not we know we're doing it, whether or not we, are just trying to believe it. Like we cannot take characters at face value. I guess no, that's fast. So I'm not going to talk about it right now. But it's just, yeah, like a character can say one thing, but that doesn't mean it's going to be true unless proven otherwise. And I guess that's what I feel like I wish we had seen a little more of early on. Again, like I said, I think fandom has really evolved. We've gotten to this understanding of how Kimchi writes. what she's doing, what kind of story she's telling, that ultimately I Love You is a story about people's struggles and how do we deal with our own struggles and how do we meet all of our needs that are unmet and what do we do to fulfill those needs and how do we respond to people who are also trying to fulfill needs. um, I know it kind of comes up a little bit with the parents and how to some degree I feel like yes, all of the parents in I Love You have failed their child in some way. But something that I Love You made me start thinking a lot about is that parenthood, like it is so easy to sit here and say that as a parent, you have a responsibility to do the best for your child. And that's true, right? But it's like, how do you do your best when you have circumstances? For instance, I was raised in a household where we were a single income family because my mother was from a very young age disabled. I had to fulfill a lot of those motherly roles to stand in and help her out, to help take care of her. My father was working multiple jobs. I remember at one point in time, I wasn't seeing him except on the weekends because of the hours he was working. Was that fair to me as a child? Absolutely not. Do I feel resentment about it? I definitely do. I think I think we can see how that relates to I Love You and the fact that, when you're trying to do your best for your child, sometimes your best isn't good enough. And that doesn't mean that you're doing badly. It doesn't mean that you're failing them. It's unfortunate circumstances. And I think that, like how you were saying that a lot of the times in life, there are things that are never going to be explicitly stated and confirmed or made clear for us. I think likewise, there are always going to be situations where maybe nobody's really at fault. You have no, you might be angry at your parent because you put them into that circumstance, but did they really fail you? And that's kind of that complexity and grayness that I think I Love You handles so well. Like when we look at Rand and how has he been a present father? Good God, no. Has he made his children feel like they are loved? Absolutely not. But is he doing the best that he can? I mean, he's doing what he can. Does he have any other options? What did he fail his family because he and Nessa created a child who probably wasn't supposed to happen? I'm willing to bet Nol was an accident.
Oh,
And based on the way that she wrote that maybe they didn't even think that she was going to be able to get pregnant. And then, oopsie daisy, now we got Nolan Oliver T. Lockling.
and like, I feel like one of the things with I Love You is that we very pointedly have these foils between people who are emotionally trapped and people who are physically trapped, where their
Mm-hmm.
circumstances mirror each other, where like it's, you know, it can theoretically be easy to, see in Rand where he should have been a more present father, where he should have done this, where he should have done that, and feel more, you know, I guess more kind of negative feelings towards the way that he parented. Um, but then when we look at someone like Simhan, where, you know, he has no money. If he doesn't work, they're going to be evicted. If he doesn't work, they can't pay the bills. Um, he doesn't have anyone else in his life. They have no family. Shin-Ae's mother left with Shin-Ae. Um, and there's no one for them. Everyone in town hates them because of the legacy that was left behind by not them. And so he has to work these long shifts. He can't be home. He can't make any more money than he does because he's already working such long shifts to make the bare minimum.
Mm-hmm.
He can't fix their food insecurity. He can't fix their rent issues. He can't fix how the town talks about them. He can't manifest people out of thin air to be support. And there's kind of an increased base level of sympathy for him because we can see how they physically won't survive in other circumstances. There's nothing that he can do about this. But at the same time, as we saw with Shin-Ae, where she lashes out at him, it is something that affected her and is something that affected their family. And it is something that shouldn't have happened to her. And she is allowed to be angry about it and she's allowed to be hurt about it, even if nobody was necessarily wrong or
Mhm.
malicious, because everybody was doing their best. Their best just wasn't able to breach those circumstances.
I feel like that was one of the hardest things about becoming an adult myself is learning to forgive your parents for circumstances that you acknowledge were beyond their control. Because, right, like you want to be angry at somebody, and the, the concept of being angry at a situation, I think, is a lot harder to grasp when you're younger because that's such a vague, abstract concept yet, right? Like to you, if somebody, like if this is a bad situation, then somebody caused that situation, right? But it's like, did my parents cause that situation? No. Did they have us young? Yes. Were we both accidents? Unfortunately, yes. Does that mean that they were bad for bringing us into this world? Not necessarily. And we do see that with Shimhan versus Rand, is that Rand is further trapped. He doesn't have the opportunity to show his sons that he loves them. He never gets to take Nol aside and apologize for bringing him into a world that is so cruel to him and was never going to accept him no matter what. But, something that Shin-Ae does get with her father is that despite how hard things are for him, ultimately he wants to give her the easiest life he can. Can he give her an easy life? No, he knows that, but he's trying to give her the easiest life he can. He doesn't want her working because he wants her to be able to focus on school and get the good grades that he knows that she can. I feel like there is, even though he's very absent due to his working hours, I've never once had the sense that Shimhan regrets her, that he doesn't love her. She's clearly the most important person in his life. And he is the most important person in her life. Again, the whole fact that the black and white form will only happen because she is trying to save her dad. And like that gets to me, like that moment where she's biting Yui and like it's posed in an almost comedic way, but she's literally wailing about how she just wanted to help her dad, that she has always been a good girl, so why is this still happening to her? That kills me. Like that just because at the end of the day, like this is not to like go off on a tangent, but like this is why I got so upset when we finally got that balcony scene and people were so upset that it was not Kosuke or Dieter or Nol who showed up. And I'm like, first off, we are the only people who built up that moment, guys. Like, let's be real. But the fact that it was her father made so much sense because he is the reason for this story. Like, yes, going to the masquerade and throwing her drink on Nol is kind of where things all started. But I think, like we've talked a lot about how the black and white formula really seals Nol and Shin-Ae's friendship and it gives her the trust to, you know, be that same friend for him that he was for her. She opens up to him on a level that she has not opened up. She had not yet opened up to other people. So ultimately, he is such a major reason for this story. And I think that's why like watching this part of the arc kind of hurts a little bit because I think even Shin-Ae herself knows that, her father, it's not like he's intentionally failed her, like she's saying things without speaking because that's what we do as teenagers. She's being honest because she's never gotten the opportunity to be honest. She's always had to play that good girl role and she doesn't want to keep doing it. She wants to say what she wants to say for once. And like you said, she has all rights to be angry. She has all rights to resent how their life is gone. It doesn't mean that she hates him, but I think that's, yeah, one of the hardest things about becoming an adult is having to reconcile with your own upbringing and, did your parents really do the best for you? And kind of just like this is a whole thing that I'm not going to get into right now, but yeah, it just it goes back to generational cycles. Like it always goes back to generational
Oh,
cycles.
it does.
Um, what are you as a parent passing on to your child that you don't even intend to? You know, like my parents definitely passed things on to me that I don't think they intended to pass on, and I'm still dealing with that. We see Shin-Ae dealing with that. You know, she takes after her father so much, which makes sense because he's like the only parental figure she's ever had. So he is literally who she's modeling herself after up to this point, where it is it's very difficult to talk about your weaknesses. It is very difficult to admit your failings. And I think, especially as a parent, that's really hard because you don't want to admit that you're the reason that things have been hard, even when it's true, you know? Um, where is I going with that? Point is generational cycles. We're always imparting things on people, whether or not we know that we're doing it, whether or not we have, you know, like if you have not dealt with something, you're going to pass that on, whether or not you mean it. You know, Simhan is very much somebody who bottles things up. He wants to handle things on his own. He hasn't really had people to lean on. You know, his is isn't it said that like his parents are both dead?
Yeah, like
Their mom is not in the picture. Like you said, the town hates them. And it's like, who do you lean on? And yeah, feelings.
and like with the generational cycle specifically in the parents, like it in addition to this theme of like we can try our best and but under the circumstances like it might not be able to do what we intend because we're just not able to. Um like a lot of the way that the parents kind of impart these generational cycles is by specifically trying to avoid their kids going down the same path as them. With
Mm-hmm.
Simon and Shin-Ae, like you said, they're so alike, and she doesn't want to be a burden to him, but he doesn't want to be a burden to her, and he wants her to be able to not take the same life path that he did. The reason that he wants her to study is so that she gets into a good college and can get her degree and get a job that will pay her more than what his job pays. The reason that he's, so anti boy is because he had her young and he doesn't want her to do the same thing. Um, the like all of these things, but in doing that, the reason why she ends up at the formal is because she's trying to help him through circumstances that she wasn't allowed to. She ends up taking all of these jobs and signing these contracts because he doesn't allow her to work and she has to go behind his back because while he doesn't want to be a burden to her, she doesn't want to be a burden to him. And in the way that a lot of our parents in ILVU and a lot of times in real life try to put their children on a better path than what they had and avoid them making the same mistakes, lead them straight to them on a different avenue. And we see the exact same thing with Rand, which we talked about a whole
Oh,
bunch of episodes, where he hides his intentions from his children, but he so strongly tries to veer them off of his path. But in doing that, the way that they perceive it ends up leading them straight down his life.
I love dramatic irony so much. Yeah. I know this is completely like away from our original topic. I was looking at our list like, oh, we haven't even gotten to things that we meant to get to. But that's what the podcast is all about. It's about
As
Trashellie just
going
vibing.
as somebody said, isn't a podcast meant for tangents?
And boy howdy. We literally we have outlines and it's like, you know what? This is merely a guide.
They're pretty
Um,
deep outlines too.
they are.
But no, it's like this is all of the stuff that we can't do in the writing where like, you're going through and you're replying to someone, then you're like, oh, I have this thought and this thought and this thought. But with the writing you can parse yourself out and be like, no, let me get back to this. Let me get back to this. Whereas in like a verbal format, it's just so easy to keep following it to wherever it leads you.
Right. And that's, you know what? We're letting it lead us. Also, generally I love to talk about the things about I love you that I love because there are so many of them, obviously. Um, but to go back on topic a little bit, before we forget about them, I wanted to point out about the subversion in I Love You is that it doesn't apply just to our main characters. We've seen it even in our it feels really wrong to call Dieter a minor character, but even in characters like Soshi and Dieter and Maya, we get that subversion. I particularly love it in Maya because of the way we're introduced to their relationship and how at face value they have a really bad relationship. And like I'm not denying that they have a bad relationship. It's true. But something that really stands out to me whenever I reread is how in that early arc when they're at the hospital, like Maya literally takes down Kosuke because he's confined to Shin-Ae. It's like she would not do that if she didn't care about Shin-Ae. And like I think that's what makes their ultimate culmination and confrontation so good is because we get to, it even though at face value we're talking about Maya's jealousy, she's jealous because she cares, because these are people, including Shin-Ae, who matter to her, who mean something to her, Um, I think it's really easy to take somebody like her at face value, and assume that, oh, she's just jealous. They don't have anything in common. But it's so clear that they both wanted that friendship. They just didn't know how to go about it. And because Maya had all of these other expectations riding on her shoulder that, this is something she's doing for her brother and it's not something that's naturally developing between them, she carries that extra resentment. Um, and that broke my heart. Like I'm gonna be honest, when we got Maya's little flashback, I cried. I love girl friendships, and I especially love girls who are so different from each other, still finding that common ground and so uplifting and caring about each other. And I especially love that we get to see that Maya's not completely recovered from it. Like, you don't just throw that kind of resentment away. It's something she's still working through. She's being mostly honest with Shin-Ae. I'm not gonna lie. I noticed that one time that she closed her eyes and like, Maya, be more honest. But I I loved getting to see them reconcile. Like, that meant so much to me.
Agree, and we can see so much of, like, that concept of they cared so much and they wanted that friendship, but they just didn't know how to build it in, like, first, the confrontation with the cake, where she baked this orange cake, this thing that she knows Shin-Ae likes, she bakes it for Shin-Ae, but she just leaves it. Min-hyuk comes home and she starts feeling that resentment again, and she doesn't know what to do with it, so she just leaves the cake and she pretends that she didn't bake it for that. And then Shin-Ae just walks into her room and, like, just looks
Why
straight
did
at
you make that
why
cake?
cake. Doesn't matter. Why did you make that cake? Stop asking that. Why did you make that cake? And then they she yells about it and she yells at her and they just air everything out. And so much of the point of like so much about them is that they just needed that honesty and needed to be let in, where they both didn't know how to let each other in because they are so different and their communication is so different and their lives are so different. Um
And
and like
being afraid of that conflict in general. Because
yeah,
Maya's doing this. Maya doesn't want to let down her brother.
yeah,
Shin-Ae also does not want to let down Minhyuk, but she also does not want to alienate herself from the only people who have, like been by her side. Like when we finally got some more of those flashbacks and we saw how much time Shin-Ae has really spent with Maya and Rika, despite you know, how different their friendship levels are. Especially following the the Shinlissa flashback, where, at the end we see all four of them walking around together. When you sit down and realize that, because Minhyuk is a year ahead of them in school, Maya and Rika were the ones who watched Shin-Ae go through those changes. They watched how she went from this really bold, vivacious, more or less outgoing person who just withdrew so much and let people just say things about her and pretends that it rolls off her shoulders. And that's, again, that's why Maya was so hurt to find out that Shin-Ae is reaching out to these people she's only just met that she barely knows, because Maya has been there this whole time. And why can't you reach out to us? What about us is not good enough for you, kind of feeling.
And
And again, that layer of resentment.
and especially considering it had only been what, a month and a half.
It's such a short time.
Yes, and it honestly is insulting that she, felt such a need to hide it from them. But also the reason that that happened was because they had never built those genuine connections. But they had never built those genuine connections because they were both afraid of the fact that they needed to air things out in order to build those, in order to communicate and be honest and be let in by each other. But that carried the possibility of so much sourness. And we can see in the girl talk scene in Maya's bedroom that when they do let each other in, they are able to see each other. And we see that in their reconciliation. We see that in the bedroom where, they put aside all of these different communication styles and all these resentments and all of these, like, hangups about each other. And they can just see each other.
Mm-hmm.
Shin-Ae sees Maya's feelings throughout her life and why she resented Shin-Ae. Maya sees Shin-Ae's feelings and why she is reacting and having the emotion she is and lashing out. And she is the only one who saw it. And it's just that they just need that space to be let in, but they do care about each other.
When they have that kind of follow-up conversation where Maya kind of asks, like, do you hate me, or something to that extent, and Shanae's like, I don't hate you, like, we had a fight, but that doesn't mean that I hate you. And I think that is something that people struggle with in general. Like, again, I am very adult age and I still struggle to let my friends know, like, hey, you said this thing that really hurt me. It made me feel like I'm kind of being slighted. Like, I had this conversation with one of my closest best friends who I have known for like well over 10 years at this point. And like, logically, I know she never intends to dismiss my interests or make me feel small. So logically, I knew that if I brought this up to her, she's not going to get mad. But kind of like you said earlier with characters like Alyssa, where you've had those moments that reinforce something that may not be true. Like, you have a moment where you do fight with somebody and it does go badly, and now your gut reaction is never tell people how you're feeling. They're going to get mad and hold it against you. And I told my friend about how she made me feel, and she was so apologetic, and like, we had a good conversation about it. But like Maya had that fear. It's like, do you hate me? And it's like, no, like, this, we needed to have this conversation. This is what's healthy. This is the only way that we can help each other. Like, Shin-Ae had no way of knowing how Maya felt if Maya hadn't come out and said it. And likewise, Maya didn't understand that the only reason Shin-Ae wasn't relying on them was because she doesn't want to feel like a burden. She doesn't want to take advantage of people who she thinks have done so much just for sticking by her. Like, again, like, that bare minimum of friendship is such a high bar for her because nobody else has done it for her. And like, that breaks my heart too. But our girl is learning and she's growing, and I'm proud of her.
I'm so proud of her. And just and just yeah, like that, like, and especially like I feel like there's kind of multiple aspects of the, like, a it is hard to reconcile that somebody can hurt you somebody can be hurt by somebody and no hurt was meant, and maybe it shouldn't have happened, or maybe the choice is obvious to others that that hurt was going to happen but they didn't realize it, where there can be only good intentions but still hurt, and still sometimes so much hurt. And also that one person's hurt can kind of spread around, where if if one person is hurt by something and it's expressed and brought up, it can make other people feel bad about the fact that it happened, but that's not, you know, against that person, but it still fosters all of those like fears and negative feelings in all regards, even though once you process and communicate and get through the hurdle, that's what makes good relationships and strong communication and like kind of puts things back together.
Right. And not to, make this Stalkyoo again, but that's such an important thing that Nol has imparted in Shin-Ae is that the people who care about you are going to want to have these conversations, even when they're hard. Like when he gives her that talk at her house about how, if people don't like you for who you are, then fine, that's their loss. They're the ones who are missing out on things.
You're more enough in
He
my book.
Yeah, oh god. Okay, tangent, but like here's the thing, okay? Nol has this tendency to, especially following the formal, he has this tendency to exclude himself when he's talking about Shin-Ae and her friends, right? Like when he talks about how you have friends who you can go to,
It's
and
always, he's not in there. It's always he's talking
he's
about them.
right. He pointedly excludes himself, but he still goes around and he says things to her like, "You're more than enough in my book."
Where
What
it's
are
like,
you doing? Think for a few seconds before you speak.
and it's like
Oh,
he's overtaken by these things. It's always, as always, and we talked about this
it's the
always.
disarming.
Yeah, they just act on instinct around each other, and he acts on instinct around her and lets his walls down. And he even like, I mean, he plays it as the Yeong-Gi mask and the like, oh, I'm sorry, I said that I would tone it down. Oops, I'm really failing at this. But he probably was genuinely surprised at what a
Mhm.
strong statement he had made. Where this whole time he's excluding himself from her friend groups. He's excluding himself. Where like, she can she can be supported by him and he will prop her up, but it's pointedly that he, as who he is as a person, is not that genuine friend that he wants her to
Mhm.
have. But then he goes and says things like, you're more than enough in my book, and it's always so pointedly from him, solely him, only him in the equation when he says things like that. And he catches himself and he realizes that he has done it, and he plays it off that way, but there is probably that very genuine shock of, oh my god.
He has a way of making him be honest. And that's just my favorite thing to reread in their experiences is just how often she brings out that honesty in him. And I think it has so much to do with, again, the fact that she is a person who sees him and he indulges in that and he wants to continue to be seen by her. But also because he sees so much of himself in her, that right in those moments, he can't help but be overtaken by that honesty because nobody has told him that he's more than enough in their books. And, like I've said before, like a long time, long before we realized that he was befriending people for his, for the purposes of like atoning and stuff like that for absolution. Um, I'd always wondered, does he give to people what he wishes people would have given to him? And I think those can both still remain, you know, two things that are honest. Like, obviously, he was befriending them for the express purpose of trying to put good into the world. And in doing that, he gave them the kind of friendship that he wishes he could have, but that he believes he does not deserve. And so, especially with somebody like Shin-Ae, who he just sees so much of himself in, who like they're literal mirrors. Like they look at each other and they just see themselves. He can't help but be honest. It's the fact that you're more than enough in my book, but it's even things like when he deliberates about calling her back after the dinner with the Kims and his family, and he winds up caving and calling her, and that whole phenomenon of you're on the phone, so you're not face to face, it's a little easier to be a little more honest with people. Um, I've never like written up anything big about this, but I do kind of like have this running, I wouldn't say theory, but I would say that there tends to be like a little trend of characters able to be a little more honest when they're not looking face to face at each other. I think we see that in, I want to say it's like episode 118, but I think that number is probably wrong and I'm pulling it out of nowhere. But with the earbud episode, right, where they're sitting on the bench together, he's pointedly angled away from her and he's looking away from her, and they're kind of talking about something where he's being a little more honest than Yeong-Gi ever would have. When she asks, "Why did you want me to invite Kosuke to the party?" And when he admits that part of it is because he doesn't like how Kosuke's been treating her, and he wants Kosuke to be in that same situation and, have that same feeling of this is what it's like to be in an environment you're not prepared for. This is what you've been doing to Shin-Ae this whole time. And like he's not looking at her when he's telling her this, and he's being more honest than he normally would be, and how he goes on to say like my favorite line about how like he knows that she can take care of himself but it won't stop him from caring. And like that's such an honest line from somebody who is fighting to like walk away from these people and pretend that he can actually leave them, to
Someone
admit
who
that it won't stop him from caring. Like all of his efforts, they're failing. He can't stop caring. And he admits
someone
it to her.
who literally started all of these relationships believing that they're fake, coming from a point of absolution, always intending to leave them and just step out of their lives and have them be better off afterwards when than before they knew him and when he was with them. To just be able to say that it won't be able to stop him from caring, and that's
Ugh.
ultimately him admitting it to himself too, where he,
Mhm.
like you said, he doesn't want to care, he's not aiming to care, but it just happened and now it's there. And it's like another thing that I kind of like about No's character that I don't know that I've explicitly talked about is kind of this idea like between different forms of selfishness. Um,
Mm.
because like he views everything that he does out of a place of genuineness as selfish. When he indulges on wanting to be with Shanae, when he indulges on wanting to be with his friends, those relationships becoming real in the first place, him doing anything for himself, like applying to Oxford, like going to jail, which he ultimately did for himself. Um, and like any of these things, but especially people, especially the relationships, he views them all as selfish. And so he tries to pivot and be absolutely selfless and do things not at all for himself and for the world. And that's where we get the whole, he pretends that he doesn't want attention and care and that it is always checking on others while saying that he's fine, but he caves so much for Shanae because she sees him and she cares about him. But he says it himself when he's talking to little buddy that, while he started all of this on a path of trying to put good into the world and making up for his past wrongs and, evening out kind of the karmic justice, that pretending to be people's friends and using them for absolution isn't really doing good. And like that was ultimately selfish. He wanted a way to feel like he was able to bring good into the world in some way, some form, able to right these wrongs of the past, be something above negative if he still has to be on this earth, um, which can be considered a selfish desire and ultimately hurt people because it wasn't genuine. But when he indulges on the things he genuinely wants, these same things that he overtly considers selfish desires, like being friends with people, um, that's when things like I don't want to say go right because they don't really ever go right in I Love You, but like
They go in a different direction than
they
he
go, yeah,
wants, or than he thinks it's supposed to.
yeah, they go in a different direction than he thinks it's supposed to, and like those are the times when people don't get hurt when he's acting upon genuine selfishness. And like the wording is strange, but
Mm,
it's worded like that because I want to compare it, where it's so much more that it's a difference between genuineness and ingenuineness than selfishness and selflessness, because your own motivations are going to be in everything. Um, but like what hurt everybody around him was him being fake about things and trying to push away what he actually wants, because everything in life is a give and take, and people need their own needs met,
mhm,
and relationships can't be genuine with somebody doing all of the giving and somebody doing all the taking, which is something that we also see with Shin-Ae and Dieter, and
mhm.
why he needs to set those boundaries for himself. And it's not okay for him to be, the picture perfect, ideal potential boyfriend that everybody wants Shanae to get with, which I'm saying that more in relation to the characters than fans, even though there are also fans like that.
Right.
The whole family is like, well, why? What about the sweet German boy with the big hands? We love him. Why don't you like him? Uh, and it's like, their relationship ultimately isn't healthy because he's doing all of the giving and she's doing all of the taking, where that balance is necessary. And this has gone a bit on a tangent from where it started. Uh, but there's that concept of like, you know, none of what none of what any of the characters do is truly selfless, because our own interests are in everything we do. Even if our own interest is, I genuinely want to do good in the world, that's still something
Mhm.
that you personally want. But it's so much more about being genuine about what you're doing and being honest about your feelings and being honest with other people and with yourself and communicating openly than it is about objective right or wrong or selflessness and selfishness.
Again, not to be me and go back here, but when you were talking about like that realization that these imbalanced relationships based on the concept of absolution and how by all technicalities, yeah, they were fake relationships, is something that he realized was in fact selfish, was in fact bad. The fact that it's only when Shanae asked how much of it was real that
Yes,
Noel finally breaks. And like, I remember at the time interpreting it as obviously he's reassuring her that it never meant nothing. But once we get to that episode where he's talking to little Buddy, we realize that that hug is an apology because it became real, but it didn't start out real. And like he does feel bad and he understands that he has hurt her and that he has hurt the rest of them because of his intentions and how it was never meant to be real. Like obviously what matters is that it became real, but the fact that that's what breaks him because he knows how terrible it was to befriend people like that. You're not doing good. Like, no matter, even, like, besides the fact that he was doing it for ulterior motives, like you said, that imbalance creates such an unhealthy relationship. They're out here putting Yeong-Gi on this pedestal. You see it in like how both Dieter and Shin-Ae talk about him and the role that he's played in their lives. How he was that person who was there for them when they had nobody else. I suspect it's a little different for Soshi since they both kind of began this relationship with kind of dishonest intentions on both sides. But like with Dieter and Shin-Ae, who were like, this is a guy who just kind of like pushed himself into my life and made me care about him, to find out that, wow, what if he never actually cared about us at all? Like, and him realizing that that's the way that he hurt them. It wasn't that he's walking away and leaving, it's that he made these people care about him and that imbalance was there. He wasn't.
he never
They want
care back.
to. What's that?
He never intended to care back.
Right. Like they're out here trying to be a friend to him. Like again that time when Shanae uses what little money she has to
To
buy Noel. ointment and medication, even though he refused over and over. Like it, they just so badly want to return the friendship that he's given them, and he's blocking them at every opportunity. Like again, Shin-Ae's really good at disarming him and, you know, breaking him down and getting that kind of sense of honesty out of him and getting him to allow her those moments. But like, it's hard. It's like pulling teeth to take care of this man.
And like ultimately, like you said, like there's so much complexity in that hug in 151 where it's just the encapsulation of everything that has happened in their relationship and everything that it's been about, where like you said, it it started fake. He didn't want it to be real. He didn't want it to be genuine. And if things had gone his way, it would have all been fake. But there was also that it did start because he took an interest in her. He did eventually have it stop being about Dieter and start being about him wanting to be friends with her. He did form a genuine bond with her. He cared about her and she cared about him. And like you said, it is so much an apology for how everything was, but it also still carries all of that weight of the truth of all of those feelings that have come up, contrasting with the intentions and the reassurance that there was real within the fake, but also the apology that even up to that point, he had intended for it to be fake and had intended to leave it all.
He is a piece of work.
He so is.
I just like Nol is such a fascinating character to me because the more that we get to see this side of him and the more we get to understand how deeply ingrained these issues are and how, it's not something that's going to be easy to overcome. His conversation with Dieter in the hospital, where he's expressing this intense fear that he has. And such an abject fear. He doesn't know what he's afraid of. He doesn't know what is going to happen. He just knows that he is so afraid, and how it also recontextualizes 151, because once you add that understanding of why he has to walk away from these friendships that were never supposed to mean anything that he comes to care about, and the fact that it's because he cares that he feels like he needs to leave. It's because he cares that he is so afraid of bringing any more harm to them. Especially because, again, these are people that he befriended because of their misfortune, because he wanted to improve their lives. So for him to believe that misfortune is always going to follow, and if he starts to care about people, it's going to bring them harm. He the whole thing is he wanted to be here to help them. This is like the exact opposite. And obviously it's not that easy because your feelings just they just don't go away. Like you can't reel them back in. They're out there. And I think that's oh, what's that?
I just said they just happen.
Right. And I think that's something that's really satisfying about the arc that we've been in, or maybe it's multiple arcs at this point. But just, how meaningful that birthday party is, what it means for them to come back to him after he blocked them. He's been avoiding them. He's got Nana lying for him. And the fact that despite all of this, they're still there for him. It's just like I'm hoping that, or not hoping, I guess I'm really looking forward to the point where Nol is able to embrace all of this without the fear. And again, I know that's so deeply ingrained. It's not something that's going to go away overnight. It's something that he's going to be learning as he goes. But I'm really looking forward to him taking those baby steps and embracing that he is allowed to be cared about. He is allowed to be seen. He is allowed to indulge in these things. Something one A scene that always sticks out to me is how after Nol makes Shin-Ae laugh during her dance with Kosuke, and how she like makes an immediate beeline to go check on him. And that moment where he said the whole like, we're friends,
We're
right?
friends, right?
And his eyes are closed. And I used to puzzle over that for so long because it's like, what does this mean? Was it, because obviously, like, something that we talk about a lot is that when she laughs, he has that moment of, I'm going to call it quiet realization. I don't think he's aware of what he's realizing in that moment. It's something that, like, really shocks him. And kind of, I guess it kind of ties back to how everything he's doing is to try to make people's lives better. To be the reason that she laughs and smiles like that during such an uncomfortable moment, and how, I think that's one of those moments where he's starting to realize this is all too real, but she is in a place that she's not supposed to be. He knows that she's, she didn't make it a secret that she's kind of afraid and she doesn't want to be there. He believes that this must be his fault and related to him. And it's kind of like, they're not supposed to be friends. But, despite, like, again, like, one of those things is because it's this moment where she's so uncomfortable, but she still goes to him to check on him and ask how he is because she noticed that he didn't look okay. And just like, how do you deal with the enormity of realizing that this is a person who has come to care about you, who wasn't supposed to care about you, and you enjoy them caring and you want more of that, but you're also afraid that by indulging in that, you're going to put her further in harm. And like you said about that concept of life reinforcing what you believe, whether or not it's true. She shows up at this formal that she never would have been at otherwise. He's indulging in how much she cares about her and protecting her and taking care of her. And she winds up falling from the balcony.
Ugh. And it's like you said, there's just so much complexity in all of it. And I think like with Noel specifically, he has so many of these moments where he can tell that something has changed, whether it's something in him or in somebody else or in the situation. And he's ultimately a character trying to exert a lot of control over life. Um, and like one of Shanae's big issues with him is the like, you don't get to be the sole determiner of what happens in our relationship, where he does want that control over it. And part of why he doesn't want to care about them and doesn't want the friendships to be real is so that they follow the mold and the idea that he wants them to, where he, he's the one who makes her laugh and she sees him and she's concerned about him and he can tell that something has changed but probably can't put real words on it or really conceptualize and process it. He just
Mhm.
has this complex feeling that there is something going on there and just comes out with the we're friends, right? Like as almost a reassurance to himself that
Mhm. Mhm.
they're the same. And I know we talked a little bit earlier about like him likely befriending people and trying to be the friend for him that he would have wanted for himself. And so like kind of in a similar way that I don't think befriending Shin-Ae was always purely about setting her up with theater. Not that it wasn't consciously that's what it about, or that he like had, a huge interest in her for himself at the beginning, but that
Mhm.
there was that like curiosity and that like he probably did want to act like get to know her and befriend her. Where like when he kind of picks up these people, um, in the same way that he wants to be the friend for them that he never had, he wants to do that because deep down he does want those friends and he does want those connections and those bonds. He just also, like you said, is so scared and has these beliefs about the world that are reinforced. So he feels like he's not allowed to want that and that he shouldn't want that and then that's not how it works. So he makes himself believe that he doesn't actually want it anymore, which is why when people do care about him, and by people I mainly am saying Shanae, um, it gets to him so much. But all of these relationships were started with such complex intentions because none of our characters really understood what they wanted from these relationships, what they were getting into in these relationships, how they were going to go. And like, I think a really good example of that is with Soshi and Nol, where, like we talked about a little bit earlier, they both went into that relationship with dishonest intentions. You know, Nol went in attempting to make this kid's life better for
Mhm.
absolution that he believed to be for the sake of the universe, but was inherently, in a way, selfish for himself. Um, so she went into this relationship not wanting to be friends with this kid, but because he needed the bullies off his back and he needed the money for his family and to support his sisters. Um, and, you know, it starts and it just naturally morphs from this thing where they're both using each other for their own gain to this thing where they're still using each other, but in a way that either benefits or is neutral for both of them.
Mhm.
Where, you know, Nola's kind of in that like in between stage of Yeong-Gi where he's not completely dishonest, but not completely honest. So she is still reporting back to Kosuke and following Nol, but also being bad at his job and getting Kosuke off of their back, um, while at the same time still feeding information, but trying to make sure it's not too bad. Up until this point at the birthday party, where they're these genuine friends and they're able to kind of let go of that and communicate that like acceptance and that there's, you know, nothing hard between them because it became genuine, and that all of those things can be true at the same time where it's both a positive relationship and a negative relationship. And I love all of the complexities and the way that these relationships are built and the way that they naturally develop and the way that our characters often struggle to um process and come to terms with how these relationships have changed and reassure themselves that nothing is different or everything is different, um, and kind of have to gradually come to terms and realize what these relationships actually are and how that's happened.
So she especially is a really interesting character here too, because I feel like he was subverted very well because it took a long time to really start to realize who Soshi is and what his real intentions were. Obviously, very early on in the story, we're able to start to see those hints of him reporting to Kosuke. But something that I we've also talked about a lot recently is that we regard Dieter as the observant character because it has been very pointedly, demonstrated to us through the story and through, Kimchi's really fun, like observe sign over Dieter's head. Um, and again, this kind of like ties back to how I Love You itself was perceived as a romantic comedy. So people ignored a lot of the depth that was very apparent from the get-go. Soshi was perceived as, that kind of like class clown character. He's always goofing off, he's always cracking jokes. Nobody takes him seriously. But Soshi knows a lot more than, a lot of characters. He certainly knows a lot more than Dieter does because he has that kind of like inside view into their life. He may not know all of the details, but he has like this understanding that things are not all what they seem. But we also see as early as the arcade that not Dieter, Soshi's really picking up what's going on between Nol and Shin-Ae. He's picking up on the way that they get so caught up in each other that they don't notice what else is going on around them. Um, and not to say that Dieter wasn't noticing that at the same time, because he absolutely was, but people only really pick up on Dieter noticing this. Obviously, there's that moment when Dieter wants to invite Nol to their tutoring session, and so she kind of talks him out of it. He's like, "Oh no, he's kind of got things going on," which was true, but and I feel like even then a lot of people kind of looked back at that later and they're like, oh, so she clearly was doing that because Noel stole his crush and he, kind of like holds that against him kind of thing. Um, which I think is like a really interesting take. I do. But I think it kind of dismisses a lot of what Soshi picks up on and what he sees. And yeah, so for them to go from these very reluctant, like he very much was reluctantly befriending Noel, and for that friendship to actually become something that means something to him, that he looks forward to, that he went from being this obnoxious, irritating kid to, somebody he knows will always have his back to take on the bullies. It means a lot to me, and I feel very strongly about Soshi and Nola's relationship the way that I do about Shin-Ae and Maya's friendship, where they kind of have like fandom kind of looks at them with a little bit of, I don't want to say disregard, but there still feels sometimes to be this sense that people want to have this outright confrontation between Nol and Soshi that I don't think is ever going to happen, because that's the purpose of Soshi being at the birthday party, was, they are putting all of that aside. It's like, hey, I feel so strongly that Noel has suspected all along what role Soshi was playing. Because listen, if even Dieter notices that Kosuke stopped babysitting them, Noel has put that together. So for Soshi to show up after, again, Nol, like I feel especially strongly with Soshi because Dieter at least knows Nol is at the party, right? Like he's kind of like dragged up, like, oh yeah, look what the cat dragged in. Surprise, Nol's here. And, he's just kind of like thrown into this mediator role without understanding anything. Soshi knows even less. He literally doesn't know Nol is there until Nol falls from the banister, which, like, if I dwell on that too long, it just like messes me up, because imagine like this is how your friend re-enters your life, right? And for him to still be like, you know what, despite what you've done, despite how you've treated me, you're still my friend. I have your back. I know you've got my back. I'm still here. Stop trying to walk out of our lives. And it's very important to me. They mean so much to me, especially because of how they began and what they turned into.
And like they understand each other. Like they understand that feeling of kind of having circumstances that you can't control and starting things dishonestly because of them, and how it just morphed into something genuine,
Mhm.
and like just the worlds that each other lives in and the circumstances they're in. They they understand that about each other, and that's what makes it possible for Soshi's presence in the birthday arc to be that resolution, and for them to be okay with all of it, and for their relationship to end in this place where it is. And I just like, it's another one of those things where it's like Kimchi does all of this show don't tell and does it so well, and we don't necessarily need an explicit resolution of these things, an explicit outright
Mhm.
statement of these things, or our characters to be fully in the right or fully in the wrong, because we can just see how things naturally unfold and where they lead, and how these very human characters react to each other.
Do you remember after 152 when people were trying to say that they felt like Soshi didn't care at all about Noel leaving them because he was like, can I go play video games? And how, like,
I do.
obviously, people cope with things in their own way, but also, again, with that retrospect and with the confirmation of how their friendship began, and like you said, how Soshi knows all about entering friendships with dishonest intentions and not being completely honest about who you are or what your, motivation and intentions are. For him to be kind of sitting in that position of realizing, oh, my friend, who again, he had some of that understanding already. He knew a little, like maybe he didn't know that Noel was, the bastard son. Maybe he already had that inkling. he was in a different position of accepting this than Dieter and Shin-Ae, who were far more in the dark were. And I think again, it just goes back to how I feel like Soshi is a character who kind of gets underestimated because he's been treated for so long as how, like, he's the big joke of the story, but there really is so much more to him than people have given him credit for sometimes.
Absolutely. And I'm going to point out that we are right about at our cutoff time.
Yep. Yep. Hey, we did pretty good. We only had one point that we didn't really get to address, and we got to give people a lot of unanticipated Stalkyoo feelings, which maybe should be anticipated because it's us, but it was not advertised.
Yeah, remember when we thought that this episode was actually only going to be around an hour?
Shh, shh. One day, this is going to be only 1 hour long. And it's going to have to be like when we have like this like super pointed, okay, this is the only thing we're going to talk about, and stop going on Stalkyoo tangents, you guys. Just stop it. We can't stop it. I'm so sorry. I'm not sorry.
If we ever manage to not go on tangents as we're talking about, which I don't know if that's possible. But are there any last thoughts that you have?
Or just like any commentary. There's been some really good commentary as we've been reading along. I'm really sorry that we have not had a chance to bring things up. I like how Mars was talking about how, like, a point that you were talking about is how everyone has a bias no matter what. Especially that thing about wanting to do good in the world, because it's about what you want, and how that already makes it a very dishonest kind of concept. We've got a lot of good commentary about girls and how we're all here for it. There's been really good commentary too about parents. Like, after we finish this, I'm going to go through and give a deeper read to that. Maybe take it to the Trashellie discussion.
Yeah, we can discuss things in our favorite medium of writing.
Just because I'm glad like the discussion about parents really resonated, because that's something that has always been really important to me in just how I Love You is told, the kinds of characters that we have, and just in general, like how we ourselves process how our parents have treated us. And I'm really excited to dig into that a little more. Mars mentioned you are special.
Thank you to everyone who has tuned in today and came back or started with this episode or is listening to the recording. We love you all, and we're so excited about this and all of the support.
We've been talking a lot about the suggestions that people have been giving us, because like we definitely have a big list of things we want to do. There's a lot of suggestions that heavily overlap with some of that. I'm just really looking forward to this, and I've been having a lot of fun. I like that you guys are very receptive of the tangents, and how sometimes you're on like this thought track and you're going one way, and then you're like, sorry to be me and make this about Stalkyoo again, but I gotta connect this to this thought that's in my head right now. And I think it is the fact that we went for 2 hours, I think should be a good indication that you guys make us feel really comfortable and very well received. And I'm so, so grateful for you guys being so supportive of this. It's something that we've kind of talked about for a little bit. And I was really hoping the community would enjoy this. So thank you guys so much for all of your support.
Yeah, it's so exciting to interact this way. And I'm so excited that we have wrapped up another episode and we'll have many more great ones in the future.
Yay!